So to get us started, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker today. Now, Urooj Arshad has 23 years of experience advocating for LGBTQIA+ rights. Now, she has designed and implemented programs on local, national, and global levels, as well as being recognized for her work in advancing the rights of LGBTQ Muslims. Now, she mobilized resources and developed programs for several initiatives, including programming at Advocates for Youth, the Muslim Youth Leadership Council, international LGBTQ youth health and rights programs at Advocates for Youth, as well as the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. Now, Urooj's experience in strategic planning, fundraising, and philanthropic advocacy has helped her to secure groundbreaking investments of over $1 million in 2017, which was used to serve LGBTQ Muslim youth and LGBTQI+ youth in the Global South. Now, her work has been featured in Teen Vogue, NBC News, the Oprah Magazine, and USA Today, and I could not be more excited to get a chance to meet and talk with her today. So, Urooj, is there anything that you'd like to add to that bio, or anything that you feel like our audience should know about you going forward? And please tell me if I have mispronounced your name. I looked up a couple different pronunciations, but I want to make sure I get it accurate.
No, you got it right. Hi, Meg. It's great to meet you and great to be here. Nothing to add at the moment.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So let's kick off here. Now, I know that we're having you here today to talk about creating support systems for marginalized people and marginalized intersectional people as well. Now, intersectionality can be a bit of a buzzword, and I know it's been, definitely popped up more and more in the zeitgeist lately. But can you kind of explain and level set what we're talking about and what you mean when you talk about intersectionality?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great way to start the conversation. So intersectionality as a word and a concept was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a current scholar in the field of critical race theory. She's a professor at Columbia Law School. And it was, she coined this word to explain the oppression that Black women experience. And just sort of reflecting on recently, because of course, as you're saying, this has become quite the buzzword, and sometimes is not understood in the way that she meant it and the way that, it's supposed to be understood. So in a recent interview, she said, and I'll just kind of quote her here, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So for me, when I understand it, it's not just about the fact that there are, intersectional identities exist, right? Like we all sit at various identities, and a lot of us sit at marginalized identities. And it's not just enough to kind of have those people in the room, right? So an organization can hire a multiple LGBTQI people of color, but if the framework continues to be, empowering only people who are in the mainstream, sort of the white supremacist context, then it doesn't really change. So, it doesn't really change anything. And so intersectionality goes beyond kind of identities and really looks at who has the power and how can that power be shifted. And so that's sort of the way that I understand intersectionality from the work that I've been doing.
I love that. And you're right. It is something that kind of, the more we talk about it, the more you get to that sort of point of semantic satiation where the word doesn't seem like it means anything anymore. But right. You're right. Like at its heart, it's about how no one person is only one thing. Right. It's just impossible. Everybody has intersectionalities. But yeah, you're right. It does require kind of that more critical thinking of, what about this person's identity is being impacted by, this external force, and not just pinning it on, well, it's because they're Asian. Well, it's because she's a woman. There are so many reasons behind these things, and they're very layered. So I think, thank you so much for kind of setting that baseline level for us. All right. So obviously, we want to kind of expand on this idea. So could you share with us your own intersecting identities and maybe talk about kind of ways that they've impacted your career path?
Yeah, so I grew up in Pakistan, middle class family, and my family immigrated to the U.S. In '92, and as I was 16 at the time, and so when I I was reflecting on this question earlier, and just thinking about like one of the ways that my identity shifted right away at immigration was that my family went from middle class to working class. So my parents had my dad drove a taxi, worked at a gas station. My mom was a teacher in Pakistan, and then she became, she worked in a daycare center. So, definitely class has had an impact on how I've navigated my life in the US. I also grew up Muslim in Pakistan and identify as culturally as Muslim, but that even, shifted from, so I do want to acknowledge that I was privileged in Pakistan in the sense that I was part of the majority sect of Islam in Pakistan. So, when I think about intersectionality, I also think about where I was privileged growing up, but not so privileged growing up as a young woman, and so those are some of the things that when we look at intersectionality, those things that come to play. I'm queer. I came out in college at 19, and so for me, I think of myself at the intersections of being a queer woman of color who's an immigrant, who is culturally Muslim, and sort of how I face the world in all of those ways all the time, right? Like it's just sort of always kind of all there. And I think that's another piece about intersectionality, especially as we interface in our work, and think about all the times, like for example, for me, I've had to put something behind so that I couldn't bring some part of my identity in the workforce, and this is something that I've kind of seen throughout my life, especially when I was younger and I didn't have as much agency. I think in the way that has impacted me, I definitely think that imposter syndrome is a big piece in the way that it has impacted me. A lot of women of color talk about that. And, it's been interesting how, in terms of my own journey, even when I have in the role I'm in now, which is a very visible, high level role, it shows up in a different way. So before it could have been like, I didn't see anyone like me in the workforce, or I didn't know what path to take. And now it's the same, but it's also like, I'm very visible. And then what does it mean to be a very visible person in this role, and also have all of these marginalized identities, and I still don't see anyone kind of ahead of me that I can look up, and I think that's been sort of the trajectory. And even in college, kind of, I remember trying to talk, I was an organizer for Take Back the Night back in the day, and even talking to white feminists about the importance of race within that context there was so much pushback. And so, always feel like, there's a way that I'm doing this work and there's not a lot of people that I can look up to, because I'm sort of fighting kind of in that moment to make space. And so absolutely, those are ways that my identity has intersected, and kind of part of it becomes invisible. One of the other ways, for example, after the shooting in Orlando, there was so much Islamophobia that was being perpetrated. And LGBTQ Muslims are kind of at the forefront trying to push for change and trying to say, we are not going to use our stories to justify Islamophobia because we are at the intersections. And what we saw post Orlando was how not to do intersectionality, which was that we saw mainstream LGBTQ organizations and mainstream Muslim organizations working together under quote unquote intersectionality, but completely erasing LGBTQ Muslims, out of the conversation. And so, it shows up in all different ways. It shows up in invisibility. It shows up in not seeing a trajectory ahead of you. And it definitely has an impact.
Oh yeah, completely. Well, and I love how you talk about, when you talk about intersectionalities, I feel like a lot of people tend to think of topics that would somehow not necessarily other them, but like things that sort of make you a target for different groups. You know what I mean? And
Right.
it's very important to highlight that not all intersectionalities are negative at all, or like, not, I want to say negative, but might merit negative feedback or negative interactions with other people. But yeah, there's also a lot of intersectionalities that come from a place of privilege.
Right.
I mean, just kind of have to look at me to pretty much know that I come from a very, I am very resourced. I am very, well supported in my life, and not everybody's like that. So yeah, I love kind of calling those two things out. Now, when you talk about seeing people, trying to look for somebody else that looks like you, and especially having the things that make you unique, not really seeing those things kind of mirrored back to you and other people. Do you think that that makes you seek out more, do you think that makes you seek out other people who kind of fit one, one or two of your identities? Like, is that a help to you, or do you think that something's missing still there because they don't really have a shared experience?
Yeah, definitely. And going back to the privilege piece too, I also wanted to mention, that I am a cisgender woman, and passing privilege. So that is another piece where I feel like, my partner is Black and non-binary and go by they, them pronouns, and just seeing kind of how they navigate the world versus I navigate the world, especially when we're traveling together and we're, in the US, at least some of the context is familiar, but when we're leaving the US, a lot of times I definitely get a lot of privilege for being South Asian, for being, passing. And but going back to kind of who to seek out, I think definitely I have mentors who have occupied, some of the identities. Like I have a mentor who, early on I met in my career, who's a gay Japanese American man, and has, and he's definitely been throughout my journey, been with me in terms of a mentor, and, gets the sense of like what it means to be a queer person of color in the US and navigate these professional spaces. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and what I also see is that there's so many more people that are occupying the identities that I do, that are now kind of, in the world. And that also inspires me, so I also think about looking at a generation that is, kind of a younger generation that is making changes that I could not even have imagined possible. So I also think of them as sort of like trailblazing in a new way. So absolutely, yeah. I think it's a different world.
Oh, thank God, right? Like, yeah. I swear, y'all, Gen Z is going to change the world, and I cannot wait to see it. I cannot wait to support it. Like, right. Absolutely loving that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that people with marginalized identities often find themselves in contexts that don't support their professional development. So what would your advice be to people watching who might be in that situation?
Yeah, a lot of young people reach out to me who, have some of the identities that I do. And my advice to people is, find the people that do see you. And I would say there have been several in my own life who are folks who are white, who had access to power, access to opportunities. And I think that maybe early on in my life, I was so dejected by people who didn't see me that but I think that as I have moved on in my career path, I feel like I focus on now on people who do. So that would be something that I think is really important. Find the people that can be in your corner, build relationships. Like I definitely feel like, and beyond the transactions, and so I've had long-term relationships with people who maybe I, aspire to be where they're at, or just found inspirational, or people who are my peers. But I think that, I'm like learning something from them. And so for me, it's been about long-term relationships that, they might end up helping in a career, or they might not, but just having that peer support network, I think. And I think it's been hard with COVID, right? Like, I think we've been so isolated. Actually just went back to a big LGBTQI global conference that convened in California. And it was just so shocking to see everyone after all of this time. So I do want to acknowledge that with COVID, there's been more isolation, but when there's opportunity to meet in person, if there's possibility for that, I think there's things that happen when you meet in person that cannot happen otherwise. So yeah, so finding that kind of connection, that kind of person-to-person long-term relationship connection, I think, and then I that has helped me for sure in terms of figuring out how I ended up, where I did.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm kind of reminded of somebody who I got to host for a chat a couple of weeks ago, talked about, it was a talk on mentorship and leadership, and trying to find people to base your career off of, or to model your career off of. And one of the things they talked about was that mentors don't have to be older than you. Like mentors just need to be somebody that knows something that you don't.
Right.
And so that was one of the things that I really found interesting, was this idea of, it's not just like, people that are younger in the workforce or a younger generation. looking for mentors, and that's how those connections are getting made. Like, it's also, something that is, kind of on the responsibility of us older generations to reach out and find those connections and find people that share some of our some of the things that make us unique. So I absolutely love that idea.
Yeah, and the other thing, that as you were reading my bio, like sort of like the resource mobilization piece, I'm not a fundraiser. I do programs. But, I think that there were times, and especially in my previous job where I was for 14 and a half years, there was a very supportive work environment where I pitched projects, and they weren't funded yet, but there was a small investment on behalf of the executive director who kind of supported an idea, and that I worked on it on the side, and that eventually led to major resource kind of investment. But, there's also this piece of like, if you really believe in the work and maybe no one is talking about it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be implemented. It's just that you might have to kind of create a way for other people to see that it is possible. So, when I started the LGBTQI program at Advocates for Youth, there wasn't anyone talking about young people in the intersection of LGBTQI and youth issues 10 years ago. And 10 years later, everyone's talking about the importance of focusing on young people because they're sort of at the front of the anti-LGBTQ backlash globally. They're used as proxies to, like when you look at anti-propaganda laws in Russia, like it's all about like, oh, we don't want to, and we're seeing the same thing here, right? Young people are at the forefront and no one is actually talking to them in terms of what they want, or at least was like 10 years ago. So it's just, it's just believe in the work that you're doing, and the resources will come, once you start thinking about a vision for it.
I love that. All right, now we touched briefly in your bio on some of the many amazing things that you've done in your work, and a lot of it is working to support LGBTQIA plus Muslims. Now, I'm agnostic, but I was raised Irish Catholic for, oh my God, way too many years. So for those of us who are outside the Muslim faith, could you kind of give us a little bit of an idea of what it is like, even just from your perspective, to be Muslim and to be part of the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest piece of it is, and I identify as a cultural Muslim, which, is sort of, for me, it's about the fact that I was raised in a Muslim environment, in Pakistan, it's like a predominantly Muslim country, and it's hard to separate religion from culture. And so for me, it's really been about a cultural identity, as well as sort of as a marginalized, minority in the US, kind of also important for me to kind of think of it myself in that way, because it just helps for me to frame kind of my existence here in the US. So one of the biggest issues for LGBTQ Muslims, and they can be on the spectrum of religiosity, right? Like there isn't one way to be Muslim for LGBTQI people, and so the biggest issue is invisibility. I was kind of talking about that earlier, and what that means is that in a lot of LGBTQ spaces, like there's been a development around talking about faith. There's more conversation about faith and how important faith is, and to reclaim faith, right? Because the right wing doesn't get to have a monopoly on faith. And so that's great. There's more conversations around faith within the LGBTQI community. The issue is it's very Christian focused. And so Muslim issues are completely invisibilized, or there's sort of a lot of like, it goes from kind of just not understanding or being just kind of, like, for example, the conference I was at recently was held during the biggest holiday for Muslims in the world, right? And so, they didn't do it it wasn't like malicious, but it was just a complete lack of understanding that, like how can you have a global conference during a major Muslim holiday, right? But but
what was the holiday? Was it Ramadan or
it was
end of
it was exactly. Eid happens at end of Ramadan. Yeah. So it's just like a big celebration, and and LGBTQ Muslims have worked so hard to try, like chosen family, given family, like it's like a big deal, and there's a lot of space that we've reclaimed for that celebration. That's just an example, right? But it's sort of And then in the Muslim spaces and mainstream Muslim spaces, it's also really hard. A lot of those spaces, focus on like the religiosity and and a lot of that is like prayers, for example, which are very, they're gendered, right? So like mainstream spaces, if you're going to go for Eid prayers, for example, there will be gendered. And then what happens to folks who are trans and non-binary in that space? I mean, that's sort of the least of, that is an issue, but overall there's, it goes from ideologically thinking that you do not belong in the Muslim community because you're part of the LGBTQI community, and all the way to kind of, again, invisibility and kind of lack of any understanding. And so I think a lot of people experience stigma, they experience discrimination, they experience a sense of that they don't have a space, there's nowhere for them to go. And it's sort of like from both communities, there's just complete like denial of, and again, like it's changing. And I think, like I was saying, after Orlando, especially, there was a lot more focus on the intersectional identities. But at the end of the day, LGBTQ Muslims just experience a lot of isolation, a lot of like not understanding the issues. And I think end up we create our own spaces. We create spaces for ourselves, which are the most validating and very beautiful spaces. But, it's just, they're limited in terms of how much resources they're getting. But there's a lot of vibrant community organizing going on in the US and around the world.
That's wonderful. I honestly, I never considered it from the perspective, like you said, of it being both a religious identity as well as a cultural identity. I feel like that kind of adds layers, and it adds a lot of nuance, because, even if you leave the church, if you leave the faith, because you feel it doesn't support you, you might also completely be losing all of your, family activities and holidays and all that kind of stuff, because it's ingrained in the culture, even if your family's not super religious. And it just,
right, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
And I think for Muslims, because we are a minority, it's hard, right? Like we can't just lose everything. But people struggle about how to keep that connection going with their families, with their communities. But that adds an additional layer for folks who are in the West.
Yeah. Now, I'd imagine, like you were talking about how visibility is so important. I'd imagine that could be, depending on the situation, fairly dangerous for some people. How do you navigate that topic? Like, by trying to increase visibility for a group that absolutely needs more recognition, needs more assistance and more resources, but you also don't want to make a target of people. So how have you had to navigate that?
Yeah, safety is absolutely an issue. When LGBTQ Muslims have started organizing, 20 plus years ago, there wasn't a mention of the space, like where it was happening, and still up till very recently. And I think still some choose to very much be, not share in public where the in-person space will be, because there are serious safety concerns. A lot of people are not out. They're not out to their families. And, one thing I want to mention is that coming out is also a Western construct. And a lot of people don't want to subscribe to that notion that just, the concept of visibility and coming out isn't the only way for people to organize. So we do have a lot of people who organize under pseudonyms, and they do a lot of the work behind the scenes, and then people who are out. And I think, again, with Orlando, a lot of people felt compelled to come out, more publicly, because they felt like their stories were being co-opted by the media and by right-wing elements to promote Islamophobia. So there's been a lot of shift. And now if you look at media coverage of these issues, people's own agency around talking about their identities, we just see a lot more people doing that work. But in terms of, when I was one of the co-founders of the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, and we had people who, were out completely, versus people who were much more concerned, especially if they were traveling and, were navigating different ways of being. And so I think it is possible, especially with so much online organizing as well. It is possible to exist in many different ways without disclosing who you are. So absolutely, it's definitely that question of like visibility and also safety, but that is a concern that we all have to think about for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we only have 5 minutes left. I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time so people can know where to follow you, where to reach out, how to support what you're doing. But one last thing that I wanted to ask, now we talked briefly about how you are an absolute expert in grants management here. What would you like our audience to know about programs and support that are available from the public sector?
Yeah, I mean, the program that I manage is called Dignity for All. It's for human rights defenders and civil society organizations that are outside the U.S. So, when you think about crises and folks, and this is happening all the time, where speaking of safety and security, people are under threat constantly on the basis of their work. So that is the work that I support, and it's absolutely, you can visit our website, and if you know folks, and if folks are joining from other parts of the world, that's absolutely available to the public. Of course, we have our mandate, but it's available for people who have experienced recent threats around their work. In terms of other resources, there is, I used to be on the board of the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice. They're a great resource for both US-based organizations as well as, again, in the Global South as well. And so, yeah, those are some of the ones that come to mind that are, that are available, that are obviously, again, you have to apply, and you have to have conversations with the people processing those grants. But those are some of my favorite organizations that are doing great work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those. Okay, in the last 3 minutes we have, let's talk about you. Let's talk about how people that are watching can support you. What do you want our audience to know?
Yeah, if folks want to reach out, I'm always happy to support folks, especially as they're figuring out their careers. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's a great way to get hold of me. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find. And so, yeah, I think that if folks have, and I also have some articles that I've published throughout my career, and they're all kind of different. One of them is about finding myself after connecting back to LGBTQI community in Pakistan. And that was really impactful for me in the way I was able to understand my identity in a decolonial way. There are other articles there that talks about my family, me reconciling with my mom, about my relationship, with my partner, and also my queer identities, so if folks are looking for just, resources to kind of think about how you navigate some of these pieces. I'm also easy to find online in terms of some of the work that I've written, and also about LGBTQ Muslim work.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have one last kind of buzzer beater question for you. What is something about your work or about the spaces in which you function that you wish people would ask about, but no one ever seems to talk about?
I think I would love for folks to focus more on, I think these pieces that you've been talking about, the marginalized identities, like how do you actually, what is the nuts and bolts of, if folks who are in these marginalized identities, how do they access spaces? How do they access the workforce and actually build out their careers? I think there still isn't so much support for that. And I think that's part of the reason why people seek me out and want to ask questions. And so how do you, what is sort of the roadmap for that? I think that's really important for folks to continue to think about that. And also for folks who have the resources, right? What is their role in kind of thinking about those things?
Thank you, Urooj. You've given us a lot to think about. I cannot wait to dive in and see the amazing work that you're doing. But thank you so much for taking time to spend with us today. It was absolutely wonderful to get to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Bye.
Bye.